All right. I am back, so we can go ahead and get started. We are going to start with Amanda from Transparent Replications. Amanda and Claire, I should say, excuse me.
Can everyone see my screen? Great. All right. So yeah, thank you. Amanda and I are really grateful to the conference organizers for the opportunity to present today. And thank you for listening and for your interest in transparent replications. So we're really excited to go through our motivation, what we do, our learning so far, and how you can help. We're actually looking for people to join our team of collaborators at the moment. So if the goals of the project resonate with you, we are sharing our contact details at the end, and we really do encourage you to reach out to us to see if you might be a good fit for the project. So our goal is simple. We want to see published papers that are more reliable and informative than they currently are. And we want to shift incentives in academic publishing towards that goal. There are many ways we could approach this, of course. But the method that we're testing at Transparent Replications is to subject many studies to replication attempts close to the time that they're published, and to share the results so that papers that are less reliable and informative are identified as such soon after people begin reading them, and at the same time so that we can highlight and celebrate best practices when we see them in order to hopefully incentivize those moving forward. So our approach differs from many of the approaches taken in other replications to date, as well as highlighting the replicability or lack thereof of findings, as important as that is. We also want to incentivize best practices across the board by systematically highlighting and celebrating them. So we have a standardized approach to selecting papers, which I'll explain on the next slide. We limit ourselves to psychology studies that can be replicated online and within our budget. But we hope that other groups and disciplines will adopt similar replication projects so that one day any paper that is published anywhere would have a non-trivial probability of being subjected to a replication attempt soon after being published. That's what we'd like to see. We do limit our efforts to recent publications because our focus is on changing incentives now and into the future. And as well as looking at replicability, we do think it's critical to examine transparency and clarity as well. And I'll explain how and why we do that shortly. So this is what we actually do. We have 5 journals that we focus on at the moment. Nature and Science don't publish papers that contain psychology studies all that often, but when they do, our policy is to subject those to replication attempts if it's feasible and within our budget. For the other 3 journals, we regularly assess their papers for the feasibility of subjecting those to replication attempts. And then we select at random from batches of 6 feasible papers at a time. Once we've selected a paper, we choose a study within it and reproduce the original results, draft the materials and the pre-registration, and then send them off to the original authorship teams for feedback. We've been really encouraged so far by how helpful the original authorship teams have been. They've often given great feedback on the project and on our materials. Once we finalize the project and sought and obtained ethics approval, we then run it on Positly, which is our recruitment platform. And then we write up the results in a report that also includes ratings on 3 criteria, which I'll explain next. We then send off the report to the authorship team for feedback and publish it on our website. If they wish to, authorship teams can also submit a public-facing response to us, which we then guarantee to publish on the same page as our report. So now I'll explain the 3 criteria that we rate papers on. The first 2 are probably already appreciated as being important by virtually everyone in the audience. Clarity we also consider to be a key to good science, and I'll explain why shortly. So we rate papers on how transparently they share their study methods, analyses, and data, and also whether they pre-registered. Although if they pre-register and then deviate from that without acknowledging it, we do penalize that, of course. If a paper is not transparent, then we can't actually know if we're replicating the original study. So our transparency ratings also affect the interpretation of replicability. Replicability is another concept that you are likely already familiar with. We do assess it in quite a simple way. Typically, we will look at the number of statistically significant results in the original study, and see the proportion of those that are also statistically significant with effects in the same direction when we run the same analyses on our data set. When we're assessing the clarity of a paper, we're asking, would a typical reader who is educated but not an expert in the field be able to, based on the paper alone, come away with a correct understanding of what the data actually showed? So clarity can suffer if there are mistakes, inaccuracies, or poorly explained parts of the paper. And also whenever there's overclaiming, even if it's unintentional, this can detract from the clarity of the paper. So the reason we consider clarity to be so important to good science is a study could have produced a data set that contains really valuable information, but unless that information is correctly extracted and clearly communicated, readers of the paper have no way of correctly accessing and using that information unless they do further investigation themselves beyond the paper. So a lack of clarity is really, in our opinion, a missed opportunity because valuable information is being lost or distorted instead of being used and built upon by others. So with that, I'll hand over to our director, Amanda, to explain what we've learned so far during the project.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you all for being here. We're really excited to share our project with you, as Claire said. So far, we've completed 8 replications since the start of the project, and we have 7 more that are currently in progress. This chart shows the ratings that each study received, with the green diamonds being good, ratings of 4 or higher, yellow being medium in the range of the 3s, and red being low, ratings below 3. And one thing I want to draw your attention to from this chart is that there isn't really a relationship between how a study performs across these 3 ratings categories. So you'll see that the one study that we had that really the results didn't replicate performed quite well in our other 2 categories. And some studies that suffered quite a bit in clarity and transparency, their results actually completely replicated. So this gives us a reason to believe that having ratings on each of these 3 criteria is adding value over just reporting on replication alone. So next, I want to share with you some preliminary impressions we have from the studies we've evaluated so far. But I want to be clear that these are only preliminary impressions. Obviously, 8 studies isn't enough to draw any sort of firm conclusions, but I think there are some interesting patterns that are worth talking about. So first, our impressions on transparency are largely quite good. You'll see here that there were no studies of the 8 we've run so far that received ratings below a 3. We saw a few studies that weren't pre-registered or that deviated from their registration. We saw a few that had some weaknesses in analysis transparency. And in one of those cases, it was very difficult to figure out from the paper what analysis was actually conducted. But for the most part, I'd say to the extent that we can draw inferences from these 8 replications, these transparency ratings are a cause for some optimism. At least in the high impact journals that we're drawing from, journals and researchers have started really adopting the open science transparency norms fairly well. And this level of transparency in these recent studies also made it much easier for us to faithfully replicate them because we had access to almost all of the materials. So moving on to our replicability criteria, this really surprised us. We expected to see a lot more studies that did not replicate or where more findings and studies didn't replicate. Out of the 8 we've run so far, we only had 1 that had really significant replication issues. And this is also, I think, a reason for optimism. Again, we can't infer too much from only 8 studies, but it seems like it's at least possible that the awareness that's been brought to issues of replicability in psychology in recent years is starting to impact researchers' practices and lead to more replicable research. Obviously, as we do more replication studies, that'll give us more either support for this optimistic hypothesis or we'll challenge that. So we'll see as we do more studies. Where we saw that there was still a lot of opportunity for improvement was in the area of clarity. And so here, the 2 studies that were rated below 3 either used incorrect statistical tests in main analyses in the study, or they incorrectly calculated key variables and had other inaccuracies in the reporting of their results. A few studies in that kind of middle range, right around 3.5, had some issues with overclaiming, where the impressions that people would take away from reading the paper might lead them to stronger conclusions than what is warranted from the findings themselves. So this suggests to us that issues of clarity really do need more attention than they're currently getting, including more rigorous review of statistical analyses, reproducing results prior to publication to prevent errors, and more attention to the connection between the findings and the claims that are being made about them. One real bright point on this issue is that Samin Vazir became the new editor of Psychological Science for 2024. And in her opening editorial, announced that they are targeting specifically statistical issues and overclaiming in their editorial process going forward. So we were especially heartened to see that other people in the open science community are also starting to notice that clarity kind of might be the next frontier after replicability and transparency in creating really reliable, informative research. So overall, our work on this project gives us a lot of causes for optimism and shows us that we think there's been a lot of progress that open science has made in advancing transparency and replicability, especially. The issues of clarity present an opportunity for improvement. And like I said, we would really encourage more researchers, journals, reviewers, other replication efforts to pay attention to this kind of criteria and consider ways to evaluate and tackle it in the future. So this project, our goal is that it's useful for the field of psychology. We want it to be helpful for improving psychology research. And for that to be true, we need feedback from the community. So the QR code and the link both go to our contact form. We would love to hear any thoughts you have about our work. And lastly, as Claire mentioned at the beginning, we would love to work with you. In addition to Claire, me, and our founder, Spencer, we partner with other researchers so that we can run more replications than our small team could do alone. And we would love to talk to you if that's something that you think you'd be interested in doing. Replications@clearerthinking.org reaches both Claire and I, and you can also see the link to our website at the bottom. Thank you so much, and we really appreciate your attention and interest today.
All right. Thank you so much, Amanda and Claire. We are going to move on to our second presentation, which is by Ed Gerstner from Springer Nature. And I'll just say, by way of an organizing framework, we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So go ahead and please be entering Q&A either in the chat or in the Q&A section. Either one works. We'll save those questions up for the end and have a little bit of conversation at that time. But go ahead, Ed.
Couldn't find the unmute button. I'm going to try and get through this quickly because I'd really like to ask some questions of the previous speakers. I think they're really interesting. Thank you for that. So I'm going to talk about state of open data with particular focus on the US research landscape. Now we've been, let's see, there we go. So we've been Springer Nature and Digital Science and Figshare have been running the State of Open Data survey for, gosh, a long time now. About 8 years, a little over 8 years, I think it is. The first survey was started in 2015. The first report was in 2016. And it's grown and grown and grown, and it's gotten broader and broader and broader as well. Originally, it was mostly focused on the US and Western Europe, and now we've got quite a good spread across the world. And so the three biggest countries in terms of participation are India, China, and the US. And we've got a fairly good spread of subjects as well. Now, I'm going to give just some very top-level results. There'll be a link to the full report at the end. And these are just top-level results. The first take-home top-level result is one size doesn't fit all. You get lots of variations from subject to subject, and from country to country.
Ed, I want to interject. We've got your title slide, but not your slideshow.
Okay, so I'm seeing it, and so I'm using. Obviously, I'm sharing the wrong one. Let's try that again.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's better. Yep.
How's that? Right,
Yep.
there we go. Ignore those. Okay, I'm going to move this back into the middle of the screen. Sorry about that. Can we? No, we can't. Okay, I'm going to look over here. So there we go. Top 3 countries, India, China, and the US. Fairly good spread of subjects. Now, one size doesn't fit all. This is an interesting slide because it shows awareness of open open data practices in the context of data management plans. Right at the top, in terms of greatest amount of awareness, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a really interesting country. Ethiopia is one of the first countries in Africa to have a national open science policy. So Ethiopia and South Africa are sort of at the forefront. So Ethiopia stands out in a lot of these surveys, and there's been a lot of involvement in. So if we go back to, there we go. Ethiopia should be in there. There we go. It's about halfway down the thing in terms of participation. So there's a lot of involvement from Ethiopia, and I think we can learn a lot from them on a number of particularly in terms of addressing cultural change elsewhere in the world, particularly in the US. But the US does fairly well for awareness. It's certainly in the top quartile. In terms of subjects, there is a wide variation. What I thought I was quite pleased by was, so this is openness to open practices, so things like open access, open data sharing, etc. And what's interesting here is that arts and humanities and social sciences are actually much higher than I would have predicted from, say, 10 years ago. There was a lot more antipathy to even open access for various reasons. So this is interesting. So when we asked participants the question, would you support a data mandate in your country? Ethiopia was at the top of the list. India was quite high. That also surprised me. The US relatively low in terms of, well, around the average, I would say. And that's been changing. That's been decreasing over time. You can imagine that maybe it's with having to. So 4 years ago, people were saying, yes, open science, open data, that's great. And now more recently, they are being required to put their money where their mouth is, or rather their time where their mouth is. And I think there's been, it's not a big drop in terms of support for mandates, but you can see it slowly going down. And what's interesting is that support going down isn't going for being against, it's going to being neutral. So being strongly or somewhat against is flat. Being somewhat or strongly supportive is slowly going down, but being neutral is slowly going up. So it's I think there's room for encouragement there. What is interesting is that when it comes to penalties for not fulfilling mandates, support for penalties is going down much more sharply, and both neutral and no opinion on that, or rather not supporting withholding funding is going up. It's still in the majority that they feel that there should be consequences for not sharing, but the trend is quite clearly downwards. Now, one of the reasons I think for this, and this isn't the only survey where we find this, is that support is not making the way to those who need it. When we asked, do you have access to support from specialists, data managers, the vast majority said no, there is no support from people who are experts in sharing, curating, answering questions even around open data. Some of the areas that they found most challenging are things like copyright, and these seems to be going up over time. Copyright and licensing, finding the time to manage the data well, that's not a surprising one. Understanding data management policies, thankfully finding appropriate repositories, That's going down. Now, this tracks with another survey that we've been doing on research integrity training. And so there's a whole big report on research integrity training where we've asked people from the US, Australia, the UK, and most recently India and Japan for how they're being trained in research integrity. At the end of that survey, we asked them, what is missing from your training around issues around research integrity? And in the US, the UK, and Australia, 8 of the top 10 topics where they felt they needed more training were related to data. So this feeds back into this narrative that that researchers don't feel sufficiently prepared yet in their training for realizing the open world. And it will surprise no one that credit is an ongoing issue. Researchers still don't feel that they receive appropriate credit for sharing data, and that's been the same ever since we've asked the question. We first asked the question in 2019, and the majority said no, researchers don't get enough credit for sharing data, and that's really not changing very much. When we asked them under what circumstances would you be motivated to share data, the top answer is citation of their papers. So they're aware of the fact that by sharing data, it increases the number of citations to their papers, and that's the thing that far and away compared to everything else it seems to be a greater motivating factor to encourage people to do more open data sharing. If you look around the middle is citation of the data itself, not anywhere near as motivational as citation of their research papers. Right, which brings me to the end. Usually I can talk for hours on this sort of thing. There's a QR code to the full report. I should probably leave that up. Well, this I will share these on the website. Thanks to Mark Hamill, Laura Day, and Graham Smith, who has helped me a lot in the preparation of these. Thank you very much for listening.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ed. All right, we are going to go on to our third presenters. We have Kristen Ratton and Sue Kriegsman, who are going to talk to us about their program to increase open and equitable meta scientists training and evaluation.
Unmute. Thank you, Katie. And thanks to the previous speakers, both were super interesting. So I am here representing I-Corps, incentivizing collaborative open research, and my colleague Sue is here representing MIT Libraries, which has launched a really interesting program called CREOS, the Center for Research on Equitable and Open Scholarship. And we are putting our heads together. Both organizations, I-Corps and CREOS, focus on the science of science, or the research on research, various topics within that. CREOS is embedded within MIT Libraries, and so they're doing original research on a whole range of different topics related to this, and they bring in postdocs to do the work, and they get to those postdocs get to connect to departments and labs and research groups within MIT, which is super helpful for them. I-Corps, we focus on trying to embed researchers into existing research initiatives that are happening out there in the world, where people are trying something or doing something new, and they haven't thought about how to do that with an experimental design in mind. And so they will frequently not necessarily set the project up in a way that we can collect data and analyze it. So as we think about open science and open research, we all have a lot of assumptions on how important that is. We all have this sort of sense of the rightness of it, and you'll frequently hear people talking about that, but we actually don't have a lot of data. We don't have a lot of information on what works and what doesn't, and where there may be advantages and where there actually may be things that are disadvantages, like maybe inequities. So as the Nelson memo, and I'm sure this screenshot's been shown about 10, 20 times today, but as the Nelson memo came out in the US and a lot of attention was suddenly being turned towards open science, you'll note that the subject of this is ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research. So it's a goal that's embedded in the very policy structure that has rolled out in the US. And I think you'll find if you look at the language of policy structures globally around this, they say similar things. So there is an inherent goal embedded in this, and even an assumption that open leads to equity, or that open is tightly connected with equity. So as Sue and I and our colleagues thought about this and put our heads together, we thought, with this increased momentum in open scholarship, it's really critical to make sure that we are, in fact, building equity, building it out, growing it, and not doing things that actually do the opposite. If you were participating in the sessions earlier today, for example, you might have heard Anna Persick this morning from UNESCO citing that international communities of researchers are actually really rethinking how they work with the US, Canada, Western Europe, and other large countries, Australia, because those collaborations have been more one-sided than they wanted. And a lot of reports and studies have shown that not everyone has equal access to the funds, the tools, the infrastructures to conduct open scholarship, which means we're inherently burdening some more than others by not having that level playing field. We already know that the very ability to conduct research and to participate in scholarship is unequal around the globe. So of course, being able to do that in an open manner is equally going to be challenging for some more than others. And then I just want to note that there's a lot of discussion around the shifting incentives. And if we shift incentives towards incentivizing open scholarship without having solved for some of these inequities, we will exacerbate a lot of these issues that are already inherent in science and scholarship today. So working with my colleagues at MIT Libraries, we sort of thought, what are the fundamental questions we should begin to answer now as we embark on this new wave and this new kind of world of open scholarship? So these are a few of the questions we're analyzing, and Sue's going to tell you a little bit about how we're going about doing that. When does making scholarship more open lead to greater equities, and when does it not, and perhaps do the opposite? What's the best way to study this? How do we analyze this? How do we launch a whole new generation of scholars who are investigating this and who are looking into these issues around equity and open scholarship? It's not something that is a recognized field per se, and the current amount of research on this is relatively scanty. And then how can we use what's happening already in the world and embed investigators into those? So an example might be a commonly used platform like Center for Open Science, or a research environment, a new research initiative launches and everybody's trying to work together. How do we try to link the level of openness in their work with the amount of equity that happens? How can we leverage this growing momentum in open scholarship to learn about it? And I'll turn over to my colleague, Sue, to talk a little bit more in detail about what we're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. One of the things we're really looking at while we're trying to do this is, as Kristen mentioned, like I-Corps is doing this work already, working with projects. MIT Libraries with our CREOS program, we have some postdocs, we're conducting some research, but we were sort of thinking if we could pull together and really, how do we get this work to be happening at scale? We know there are a lot of initiatives. I mean, this fabulous program being put on today, tomorrow, we're hearing from so many of our colleagues about all kinds of initiatives in open science and talking about open data, but how do we start to like grow this as a field? So we're really trying to think about like, how do we increase the number of people who can conduct research in these spaces, not just to understand open science, but to understand like, are we achieving the goals we want to be achieving by these kinds of projects and programs? how do we match up the kinds of scholars who have skills to do evaluations on reproducibility, for example, with the kinds of people who are conducting research? And how do we generate those partnerships? Or how do we make sure, as Kristen mentioned, equity? Like that's such a complicated topic, and we can accidentally hurt communities and people along the way if we aren't mindful of what we're doing as we are talking about open scholarship along this way. So we really want to be always, thinking about these things and creating mechanisms as we're sort of coming into this new field of meta science, the science of science. So we're trying to really sort of build up something to do this work at scale together. So we thought we could develop this fellows and leaders in open and equitable scholarship program. So we are trying to bolster the number of people doing this, matching the projects, and really trying to scale up as we're doing this to create an entire new fellowship program that we could build. And even in the building of a fellowship program, like, at MIT libraries, we already have like a postdoc program, but to build a good fellowship program where we're putting equity at the front, we want to make sure that we're doing it well and we're doing it correctly and we're doing it very equitable, fairly in a way that we can be supporting a global community also. So next slide. So the way we're trying to get this off the ground is we were fortunate enough to receive a grant from the National Science Foundation, one of their early concept grants for an eager grant, which is a one-year exploratory grant that we're working on this year. And it's called Integrating Open and Equitable Research into Open Science. And we are right in the middle of this now. It's taken us a little while to sort of get our feet under us to get going, because we're trying to be so thoughtful and so mindful about how we're proceeding. We've got 4 stages of this grant. We're doing an environmental scan right now, which is consisting of sort of a traditional environmental scan of looking at publications, what's already out there. We're trying to see where those gaps are, reaching out to people who can help fill those gaps for us. Tell us the stories about what's going on in the field of open and equitable scholarship in these spaces that we want to be studying, talking to stakeholders in these spaces, and then also identifying other programs that have fellowships and saying like, okay, so you've got fellowship programs, where are the stick points there? If we are trying to build a fellowship program from the ground up, doesn't exist at this point, like, how do we make one so it works? And we've already built on some experience from that we have at MIT. How can we do something that's even better, something that's different from where we have now, and do the analysis on this? We're also looking at the kinds of partnerships that I-Corps already has to see what sort of programs we could be working with in the future for something like this. Next slide. So our next steps is we're hoping to use this eager grant to really design the fellows program, and along the way also potentially build community, so we could start to think about, okay, we know what kinds of people could maybe do this research. How do we reach out to them? What are the kinds of partnerships we could be developing? Who might be interested in working with us? Who is sort of saying like, oh, I have a project, but I'd really like to have some more analysis done on it from a scholar or a researcher who can apply a methodology that's appropriate to my work, who can evaluate if the outcomes are, if I'm really achieving what I said I wanted to be doing. How do I tinker with my work to make sure that I'm reaching my goals? And we're going to be seeking funding for that FLOWS program. And we're hoping to launch in 2025. That may be a little optimistic. We all know how grant funding can move, but we'll see how that goes. But we'd love to hear from folks, and if you're interested in hearing more about our project, I'll put a link in the chat from our press release for that too. Thanks.
All right, that is excellent. Thanks so much, Sue and Kristen. So we have one question in the Q&A already, and I'll go ahead and ask that. And then I have a question queued up as well in my head. And while we're doing this as well, if others have questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. The question was for the first presentation about other efforts that are underway to promote the transparent replications model in other disciplines.
I guess I'll take that question. There are some other efforts underway. One organization out there that is also doing this work is called the Institute for Replication. I believe their website is I4R. I'll put it in the chat. But they have been focusing, I think, on economics and political science, and they're extending their focus into psychology research as well. And they're going to be working with psychological science. So I know there are other efforts as well. In the last session, there was a presentation from FORT, F-O-R-T-T, and they do a number of different things, but one of them is they have a replication hub where they're tracking what replications and reversals and things of findings have been done by different communities. So I'm sure there are more than that that I'm missing, but those two are the first two that come to mind. And so it's good to see that this is something that's it's a meme that's spreading. So
Thank you very much. For my question, I'm going to broaden back out just slightly and kind of return us to the theme of this session, which was actually rewards and incentive structure. And so hopefully you saw across all of the different presentations that there's a bit of discussion about how the evaluation of research can inform that reward structure and incentive process. So my question for the presenters is, I guess just directly, how do you see rewards and incentives playing into your work, and what kinds of strategies are you using to try to engage directly with researchers and their concerns about rewards and incentives?
Should I go first?
Go for it.
Okay. So, I mean, so publishers have gotten a lot of criticism because, we're all about the paper, right? Wasn't our idea that the researchers should only be assessed by their paper output. And we have constantly said that it's a bad idea. What are we trying to do about it? Well, we're hoping to talk to people to work out how do we reform the global system for research assessment, because it's doing it wrong. If you measure research based on the number of papers they're producing, you're not measuring their research, you're measuring the number of papers they're producing. What we're trying to do to try and encourage assessment of different, there are many different ways that it needs to be broadened. What we are doing in order to encourage greater open science behavior is to try and make sure that we surface the many different kinds of research outputs that are connected to a paper. We're still in the business of publishing papers, but we're trying to increase the use of the paper to say, this is where you'll find the data, and working with the community to make sure that the data is in a format that it can be findable, accessible, interpretable, reusable. The same with code, the same with protocols. We're trying to find ways in which we can increase the transparency of all these outputs. And referee reports, the more open we can be in terms of the review of the article, of the data, of the code, of the protocols, the better it will be for everyone. So we're just trying to make sure that the next iteration of what a paper looks like is geared towards surfacing and making more accessible these other outputs that people should be equally assessed by, not just paper outputs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ed. I personally found it shocking, even as someone deeply embedded in this system, that you're finding about just how much people value those citations to their papers. The effect size is just really, really large. So it's good to be reminded that that's sort of the place that we're working from. Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to kind of add on to that. And I think one of the things that we're really trying to do in this research with the flows program stems a little on from the work that we've been doing in MIT libraries, is like, we're not just talking about like, okay, so how do we surface these things, but what's at the root core of what's happening about how, like, what's incentivizing people. Like, we had a postdoc who came in who studies child development and how infants learn trust. And she took that research and brought it into the science labs at NIT about how researchers in labs learn trust about open science. And basically, it has to do with the leader of that lab and their feelings about open scholarship and open science. And the people in that lab will follow suit of the person who's leading. And that research was conducted by Ashley Thomas. And that's the kind of research we're trying to conduct with the flows program as we're moving forward. It's like, well, we can talk about surfacing citations and surfacing data, but there's culture shifts. And so we also want to be embedding experiments to say, like, okay, so what is incentivizing people? Like, we need to have those lab leaders and be like, okay, so if it's the lab leader, how do we impact a lab leader who then may impact an entire lab? And that will impact a generation of scholars. So we want to be looking at these kinds of things as well. And that's the kind of research we're trying to dig into, these other layers that maybe we haven't always been having the conversations about too. So we're hoping to get to some of these points as well.
Great points. Kristen?
Yeah, so one of the things that got me into starting I-Corps was thinking about these moments of attention and leverage in the whole cycle. And it's getting hired and getting promoted or tenure. Another is getting funded, right? And getting published has become the way to do those other things. So I actually don't think it's the getting published part we need to fix. We need to fix where those incentives sit in the getting funded and career progression, right? So that means we have to look for, and again, I'm all about trying to experiment with changing things and figuring out what happens. So looking towards, for example, Howard Hughes Medical Institute as a funder and institution that's saying those who participate and receive funds from HHMI are not allowed to use the journal name when they present their work. And the journal name is not part of their application process or their renewal process. So they're trying something here. It's a bold move. And we can study that and learn from that. Does that change behavior? Does that change culture? Does that change attitudes? What does the lab head, to Sue's point, think of that, and how do they communicate that to the people in their thing? There are lots of other examples. There are funders that are now mandating preprinting and using that as the moment of the provenance of the work. How does that change behavior? We need people in there studying it. So that's why the flows is so important. But I think that these experiments about changing all of that are happening already, and we'll hopefully be able to pull those results together and have a kind of a new view on all of this.
Absolutely. Amanda?
Thanks. Yeah, one of the reasons, we organized our project to focus on recent work when a lot of other replication projects are focused on, big key findings, is that if kind of the chance of a replication being run on your work soon after your work is published goes up, that creates a pretty powerful incentive to make sure that your work is high quality. And also, we really don't want to be kind of in the business of playing gotcha with people. And so that's why a lot of our focus is about highlighting things that have done well. And that's been something, we've gotten really positive feedback from researchers. We just reached out to another team about a project we're working on, and they said, oh, we looked at your current replications that you've done and they look great. We're really glad you're doing this. So that's been a really nice thing to see. And in some cases, I think what we're doing can even sort of provide a service for researchers, where we had a case where the study we were replicating, the researchers were very transparent in their paper that they didn't really have enough statistical power for the effect size they wound up getting on the study. So when we ran the replication, we ran it with about 3 times as many participants. And so now they have a result that they can point to. It replicated, and they have a result that they can point to that's an adequately powered study that confirms the findings that they presented in their paper. So, it costs money to recruit research participants and run studies. And so if, people's work can be advanced by another group that's coming in and is able to run those studies, that's something that they can use to build on the actual findings that they're working to learn.
Yeah, really, really good point. I really appreciate the points that all of you are making about sort of the culture shift aspects of this, because I think many of the actors in this space focus on that issue in different ways, but I particularly resonates with me to hear the call to, gather as much information as we can in evaluating these efforts and, see what's actually working to make these culture changes that we all want to see happening. Well, I will close the session, I think. We seem to be, well, let's see, maybe there's one last question. No. Um, I'll say thank you to all of the presenters and thank you to all of the attendees. And I hope to see many of you tomorrow for our second day of the conference.